Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 517 of Constructive Criticism. I'm your host, Easy, and I'm joined by my co-hosts, the man we missed last week, Mason Clark.
Hey, how y'all doing?
Can you tell the people what they can expect from you because of that?
I'm doing a standard shuffle up and play with like a couple people that should be out 3 days from the time you're hearing this. So
dope.
With Bloomburrow.
Yeah. I'm stoked to see it. I'm also joined by my friend, Abe Stein.
You know, Mason, I'm just going to say, if you had to miss the episode last week, that was a true all-timer. I'm glad it was for that reason. That's a good reason.
Well, maybe it's not an all-timer from here. Maybe I ruined it, too.
No, you couldn't have ruined it. What's so funny is Mason messaged me about an edit that was on the podcast about the story that I told you about Alicia, my daughter, calling Maxwell guys, because we would say guys to like the back of the car to like both of our kids. Mm-hmm. And the editor edited it in a way where it sounded like my wife was calling Maxwell guys.
It was so funny. It sounds like someone just said, yeah, my wife forgot my son's name at the time of his birth. And
I was like, what are you talking about, Mason? And then I listened to the show back and text Mason was like, that's hysterical. That's so funny. So, well, we are not talking about nicknames for my son given, by his little sister today. We are going to talk about the Pick 2 set review. Before we do that, though, we always want to give a shout out to our newest patrons. I want to give a shout out to Susanna today, newest patron. Thank you so much. It means the world every time we see that notification, and it's so cool. It's so cool to see that. And we're really glad that you're getting something out of the podcast that you feel like you can give back a little bit. So let's go on to some housekeeping. First things first, we're going to talk about Untapped.gg. They are the sponsor of the show right now, and we appreciate them because I use them all the time. I say this every week, but I actually got a message from somebody. It's like, Spencer, you shill this thing so hard. I finally downloaded it. And they're like, I literally can't believe how good this is compared to not having it. And I loved it. It was like one of my favorite messages I got last week. Although, just a warning, as Mason pointed out on, I don't remember if it was our Patreon episode or not, but, sometimes if you're like me, you can have a misplay because you're so used to just looking at the math that you need to remember to do the math yourself sometimes. But it is a deck tracker overlay for Arena, and we really appreciate them so much. And then also, it's brought to you. If you go to Patreon or the swag store on constructivism.com, it's a great way to support the show. We have everything basically priced, so if you buy something, we get $1. But that's about it. Final housekeeping topic. Today, as the time of the recording, the Weekly MTG, they announced that there would be no change in the ban announcements. So currently, there is a BNR update scheduled for August 26th. And if you're getting ready for Modern season, you know that it starts before then. And there's not an update before then. It will not happen. And so, just as us talking to our listeners who are getting ready for RCQs, that means you got to prepare for Nadu. Like, that's just what it means. If you're going to play in one before then, you either need to be playing Nadu or be prepared to play against Nadu. And that's it. Like, that's the end of the story. That's just kind of how it works. And we're not going to talk about our feelings about it. But just so you know, that's a thing. And be prepared if you're going to go to your RCQs. With that being said, let's go into our Pick 2 set review. Mason Clark, what is a Pick 2 set review?
Yeah, so it's just a normal set review with a good name. Basically, a typical show would do something like a top 10 or a top 8. And there's a lot of vagueness in certain spots, right? Like, for example, people often say like honorable mentions and they talk about the number 10 and they're like, kind of just like hopeful. I don't really know. Like often a spot where someone just puts a card they kind of like and want to talk about. Nothing wrong with doing it that way. I felt a long time ago this is some vagueness to the listener. So we adopted a method of picking 4 categories and then picking 2 cards each to talk about in those categories. So you end up getting about the same as a top 8 show, but there's a lot more clarity in sort of what we're talking about. So there are sleepers, which are cards we feel people aren't getting enough hype or excitement about. and we'll typically highlight that for a format where, general, maybe the deck is kind of supporting. We have favorites, which is kind of, as the name says, like, hey, this is sort of our favorite card or something we're really excited to play with, we really like. That's it. Hopefuls are cards that we kind of think have an outside shot of making it, or we kind of want to have make it. Very similar to, once again, like that 10 through 8th spot in a top 10 deck list with a slightly different context. And finally, we have hits. Those are the things that you would imagine as like a number 1 and number 2. We expect these cards to be big role players, have a big impact on the format in general. And Spencer, why don't you start us off with sleepers, cards we feel like aren't getting enough hype?
Yeah, this is a card that I was actually surprised to see in the set, considering I saw nobody talk about it and how popular the last version of this card was. And that is Hop to It. It is a white and 2 for sorcery. Create 3/1/1 white rabbit creature tokens. So I think the last version of this card was Hordling Outburst, which saw play in lots and lots of different so many different standard decks. And I believe that card was red 1, and this card is white 2. And I just listen, I get it. Magic cards have gotten better since Hordling Outburst. Like, don't get it mixed. But like, this is still 3 pieces of cardboard for 1 sorcery. And I was surprised to not even hear a peep about it. So I think it has standard potential, and that's probably it, but that's kind of where I'm at with this as a sleeper.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's obviously precedent for this card, not only from Hurling Outburst, where, I think like Jeskai Ascendancy had a big amount to do with it, just kind of like the texture of that format, but it's not like the format that we're in as far as standard. Like, Convoke is one of the premier decks in the format, and a card that maybe you don't play a full 4 copies of this, but 1 or 2 copies of this can really enable, a bit of resiliency to interaction and speakers. Just a lot of bodies in one card when you're trying to enable other cards that are contingent upon that, like with War Leader's Call or with Night Captain Nevios. It is just like a lot of material you can use in decks like that for not a lot of investment. And I think you're right in saying that, like, this has some potential that needs to be considered and tapped into. There's even cards that like care about like creature tokens in the format, and I think that's just, there's a lot of room for a card like this to play a role, especially in like this first part of the standard format before we get the full year's worth of cards.
Yeah, I think this is a card I saw like a fair amount of, like, I would say like medium plus hype for. It wasn't like, oh, this is gonna break Pioneer or Modern or anything like that. But it was something that like I saw a decent amount of love for, just standard, where it's like, this is like a pretty good body, like Spencer was saying with Hordling Outburst. And I also think it's something that is just fairly good in general. Just like 3 bodies for this is nice, and there are some really strong payoffs in the set for it. So like, if you look at the 1-drop rabbit, that every time you play like a rabbit, a bunny, a mouse, or raccoon, it gets +1/+1. So it's Champion of the Harish is what some people are calling it, Champion of the Parish clone. And that is like a really strong curve. You go 1-drop of that. Heck, you even play 1 on turn 2, maybe play a different 1-drop, you're actually low to the ground. You play something like that, you're convoking, you're kind of doing like Abe said, going. I think it is like a really solid core to a deck, and something that I think players are going to definitely like be impressed by when they play. So I really love this one as a sleeper, because I think there's some love for it, but I think people underestimate kind of how good this kind of effect can be when the support's with it. And it looks like the support is there.
I agree. While you guys were talking, I kind of just looked up like what kind of decks Hordling Outburst was played in standard specifically. And there were a lot of first place decks between state championships, IQs, SCG IQs back in the day, even SCG Opens, Red White Aggro, Atarka Red, Jeskai Tokens, Mardu Midrange, Red White Devotion. Like the card saw a ton of standard play. So just some context. All right, next up we have a card close to my heart. Heartfire Hero. This card is 1 red for a 1/1 Valiant. Creature Mouse Soldier. It has Valiant. Whenever Heartfire Hero becomes the target of spell or ability you control for the first time each turn, put a 1/1 counter on it. When Heartfire Hero dies, it deals damage equal to its power to each opponent. Okay, so this has a comp, but we got the name wrong on the comp last episode. Mason, what is the comp for this card?
Kavakis Scamp? Abe got it right.
Oh.
Once you said the other one. Yeah.
Oh. Anyway, I think this card's sweet. I had not even seen people talk about this card, and I think that the Gruul Heroic deck already often, or not heroic, prowess deck or whatever, I don't know, whatever you want to call it in standard, has put up plenty of results already, and we literally on the last podcast talked about how there was going to be a slot opening up in that deck, and I think this fits that pretty well.
Yeah, card's nice. I think the mouse archetype in general is actually pretty good. Like, there's a lot. The hardest thing is finding an enabler, and the best thing I found is Lost Jitty, where you can kind of just move around and trigger all your Valiants pretty easily. Thank you, Nadu, for teaching me that one. See, there's good from Nadu. But, I think that card is nice, and, Commando Faces Kakazan is rotating, which is a very strong red 1-drop, and the deck is looking for something like that, and this, like Spencer said, does sort of fit in with some of the other cards you want to play. Like, this guy likes to get Monstrous Rage, likes to get Audacity. And so this and some of the other mices as well, I think, are very reasonable contenders for something like this in a standard format. And with something like this too, it's possible Pioneer Hammer, a lot of its strength has been off cards like Flame Charger, the Scamp. Having another one of these maybe is really good for that Fringe deck as well. So I think this card's really cool.
Yeah, I think you hit it on the head in terms of this type of effect, in terms of Scamp or Charger, which has long rotated at this point, but just the 1/1 that when it dies deals damage to its power to any target is a tried and true playable 1-drop at this point in time. A lot of the aggressive decks playing red have been looking to play those as kind of the stronger cards in their early game, and one that has the built-in ability to scale by doing the other things this deck wants to do and by playing the other good cards with it. Its floor is already no one was playing Cacophony Scamp because they had an oil counter synergy in their deck. People were playing that card because of the ability on it and the text on it. And you're playing a bunch of pump spells. So the fact that this plays even better with the pump spells just makes that already an upgrade. And any amount of other tribal or typal synergies and kindred synergies are just going to be a bonus.
Yeah, obviously you don't have the sack ability like Scamp had, but I think that it makes up for it in the other ways that I just talked about. Mason, why don't we go to your first sleeper?
Yeah, mine is Beza the Bounding Spring. It's 2 white for a legendary creature, Elemental Elk, 4/5. And basically, it has a lot of text, but a lot of it boils down to if you're behind in something, it catches you up. So when this enters the battlefield, create a treasure token if your opponent controls more lands than you. Gain 4 life if your opponent has more life than you. Create 2 1/1 blue fish creature tokens if your opponent controls more creatures than you. Draw a card if your opponent has more cards in hand than you. So this card kind of does a timely reinforcements on a body type effect. And I think this card's just very nice. There are plenty of times where you're not even really behind. You're just on the draw. And, you play this card because you had a tap land on turn 5 or whatever, and your opponent made their 5th land, and you get your treasure, and then play your 5th land and cast a 2-drop. Or, your opponent was on the play, so you gained 4 life, or they just had more creatures, so you get a couple fish. Just a very nice body, very strong with cards like Salvation Swan, I think we're highlighting today, but the brand new Restoration Angel, essentially. And just in white mid-rangey decks, I think this is just a good card stabilizing on a good body. And, I don't want to say Thragtusk-esque, but that kind of, catches you up when you're in a bad spot kind of card.
This was literally almost on my sleeper list. This was one of the cuts for me on my sleeper list. I think that this card has a Hearthstone-ish catch-up mechanic feel. If you've played a lot of old Hearthstone, but I don't know. I think the card seems pretty strong.
I also just think that before Abe, really quick, just the draw card one's going to happen. I talked about a ton when you're on the draw, But when you're on the play and you're just curving out on your opponent, you're just like 4 or 5 draw a card, and maybe your opponent was like beating you down and you're a mid-range deck and you gain 4 life. Just like, oh, like if I'm any sort of deck trying to win on the battlefield, that's like really hard to get through.
Yeah, if we've learned anything, also 5 toughness is just so much toughness.
Yep, shielded stats.
Yeah, I mean, I think the last version of a card like this was the Lavinia and Oath of the Gatewatch. It's like a 6 mana 5/5 flyer. You like gained 5 life and got a 3/3 if you're behind on board. But when those things are on rate good enough to be doing in a format, they always see play. You know, like timely reinforcements, just at face on rate saw play, not only just as a hate card, but as a card that was in like people's main decks because the value presented was that good. I think that, you know, all the abilities on this, even at its floor of, you know, even if you get no abilities, it's like it's the worst feeling, but even that is like a reasonably static creature for your mana investment. And, you know, odds are you can find a board state where you can play this and get some value out of it, and all the other modes and any combinations of them are all good. So I think this one's definitely got what it takes.
My next one is Dream Dew Entrancer, excuse me. This is 2 green blue for a creature frog wizard 3/4, has reach, and then when Dream Dew Entrancer enters, tap up to 1 target creature and put 3 stun counters on it. If you control that creature, draw 2 cards. Misspoke there. So I think this card, it looks, I mean, for one, unlimited, probably insane, but not really why I picked it here. It's kind of doing the frog thing, which is sort of bouncing your own stuff. But I think this card's just kind of nice, and then as like a bridge card in ramp decks, where there's a new 1/2 for 3, and you basically flip over the top of your deck till you hit a land, you put that in play. And I think that's going to be like a potentially really strong role player with this card, where if you're playing against, you know, a deck that doesn't have a lot of creatures that you care about, as the ramp deck, this sort of 3/4 reach, solid body, draw some cards in standard, very nice. And then if your opponent is beating you down with something, 3/4 reach, tap your thing for 3 turns, let me stabilize, you know, get to my bigger spells is very nice. So I'm a Dream Dew Entrancer shipper. I think the card's great. Just love this card and I've been very impressed every time I've seen it. So
I think about the play patterns of this limited. I know we're not a limited podcast, but I think it's pretty funny to like think about if your opponent does this on either end, you're probably so annoyed. Like if you have like a passivism effect on your own creature, and then you do this, I'd be like, that's a feel bad. Like, oh my gosh, they had that rare. Oh my goodness. I think this card's sweet. I almost wish that it had something else. Like it feels like it's missing some words to me, but I don't know. I'm sure that it had something else. I don't know.
This is funny to hear missing words in the modern day of Magic.
I know, for real, right? That's
This card only really does. It has 2 modes to it, really. I mean, you can read the whole card in like 2 sentences. What are we doing here?
I know. I it just feels like it's missing words. I don't know. Abe, go ahead. What do you think of this card?
Yeah, I mean, ill-timed explosion at home. You know, it's a card that will either draw you some cards or answer you being behind on board. But I'm gonna have to see it to believe it, I think. Although, like Mason said before, like with some of the flicker stuff that is being supported in the set, I wouldn't be surprised if something with powerful ETB like this does have room to shine. If not now, one day.
What is your first sleeper, Abe?
My first sleeper is Iridescent Vine Lasher. This is a single black 1/2 Lizard Assassin with the Offspring mechanic, so you can pay an additional, in this case, 2 generic mana to as an additional cost when you cast the spell, and when you do, when the creature enters the battlefield, you get a 1/1 token copy of it. So you can pay 3 mana to get 2 copies of this card. It's a 1/2 Lizard Assassin, and it has a landfall. Whenever a land you control enters the battlefield, this creature deals 1 damage to target opponent. So, little landfall ping the opponent. I haven't really seen anyone talk much about this card. I might just be out of touch and out of the loop. But wasn't there an entire mechanic in the most recent like set before this, the Assassin's Creed like mini set, which entirely based around assassins dealing damage to the opponent?
I think it's combat damage, but yeah.
Did they really do that? Did they print the combat damage modifier and then print this card, Mason? Did you let them do that?
Well, yeah, I did work on Assassin's Creed.
I like that we blame Mason for everything.
I only got like 0 more releases of getting to blame Mason.
Yeah, free running, you may cast a spell if you dealt combat damage to a player this turn with an assassin or commander.
This is terrible. Why would they do this to my lizard friend?
This is an affront
to my lizard friend. I do just think that landfall deal damage to your opponent on this rate is pretty powerful, and I think they're just adding like a semblance of reach to these decks, like to black aggressive decks, tends to be really good because it can enable like a lot of different types of aggro decks to exist, and like even like a blue-black deck having access to kind of reach over a longer game can be really good. And I just think it's a powerful card at a lot of different mana values on your curve.
I think the Offspring 2 is honestly just better than people are gonna think at like face value. I've looking over the set, I thought, oh, that seems powerful. Oh, that seems like. I just think that a 1/1 version of a card that you already want in your deck for 2 mana, when you like have excess mana, is gonna be better and also help with like curve out turns. I don't know. I just think the mechanic is probably more powerful than people think it is.
I think it's also just more powerful on a 1/2, right? Like you're paying 2 more mana to draw and cast effectively another copy of the card.
Right, exactly.
And I mean, historically, like drawing a land and it dealing 2 damage to the opponent was a ban-worthy thing. Like think about Ramonap Ruins in Standard. Like, oh, my land dealt 2 to 4 damage to my opponent. Like that is a pretty real cost.
Wasn't there? Other than Volakut, I'm not talking about Volakut. Wasn't there a literal enchantment that saw a little bit of? Oh man, this is going to be the most boomer thing I've said on the podcast in a long time. So back in the day, you had 3 sets that was called a block. Wasn't there a block constructed deck with an enchantment that did this?
I'm sure at some point in Magic's history, there was a block constructed deck.
I was too young to play block constructed. They wouldn't let me into the club. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway.
No, I mean, I think like one of the interesting things is we still have Shieldred and like a kind of black aggressive deck that's trying to curve out. I think this card's just like kind of nice, right? Like 1/2 landfall ping somebody would not be a card I like jumped again in my deck, but I would be like, okay, if I'm a black aggressive deck, that's nice. And I'm already trying to guarantee like 4 mana every game, becomes a bit more appealing. And then, like y'all were saying, with the Offspring, just in the late game now, you sandbag your land, so you hope to draw this guy and you very easily get triggers. But also, like, if your opponent has removal, you're going to get the first trigger no matter what, right? But like, they can't fight through the removal because there's just 2 of them. So it's very interesting to sort of just see like these sort of cards see play. And I think the 1 mana Offspring creatures are all that have good effects. I should say all pretty good. We're going to talk about a couple of them. It's a little bit of a mini cycle, and I think they all have like decent effects. And when you get another one, whenever you're just flooding out in the late game, or just anyone ever mulligan? You ever mulligan and keep like 4 lands, 2 spells, a kill spell, and like a 3-drop. You draw this thing on turn 4, and you're like, oh, all right, I'll get double and ping you twice. Just happens. So I really like this card a lot.
Awesome. Hey, what's your next one?
Yeah, my next sleeper is Caretaker's Talent. This is a 2 and a white enchantment class, which is a returning enchantment type that you might remember from the D&D set. But the baseline of it is whenever 1 or more tokens enter the battlefield under your control, draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. Level 2 on it, so you can pay a single white to level to level 2, and then it says when this class becomes level 2, create a token that's a copy of target token you control. And then for 3 and a white, you can have it level 3, and it says creature tokens you control get +2/+2. I think that cards like Welcoming Vampire already served this purpose, although just left the format. Cards like Wedding Announcement also kind of serve in a slot of what's a advantage accruing white 3 mana permanent that's hard to interact with on the board. And I think that Caretaker's Talent plays a lot into what makes those cards typically strong. It is rewarding, staying kind of on plan of, I want to create tokens, or I want to be making a lot of permanents and often accruing additional permanents. Like that already is where you want to be, and that will reward you for that in terms of drawing you more cards, and then the ability to copy a particularly powerful, token you have. That's for a single white mana, once you already have it, is very good, and then can even trigger its own abilities. So if you're out of ways to make tokens, we have like a clue lying around, you can make another clue, draw a card, and keep going that way. And then, being able to invest in even just the threat of being able to invest face up that, like, okay, for 4 mana, I can give all my creature tokens +2/+2, puts a lot of pressure on the game in ways that, like, you kind of don't need to activate it or commit to it unless it's either winning you the game or it is the absolute best thing for you to do with your mana because you don't want to overcommit into the board in a situation. I just think the play patterns of the card are a bit better than it reads, and because something like Wedding Announcement, which just rotated out, was like so absolutely best in class at doing what cards like this want to do, it's kind of hard to feel good about what its incumbent replacement could be. But I think that giving this card a second look is probably good for a lot of people, because I think it does have a lot of potential.
This card almost made my favorites for like a couple reasons. One, I just think the class enchantments are like one of my favorite like design aspects in the last few years of Magic. I think that I think about Bard class and Ranger class, and like all of them are super sweet, and I'm a pretty big fan of them. But I really like what you said about the threat of activating the level 3 on this one, where when I was thinking about it, I was like, man, like somebody just put 3 rabbits into play and drew a card, and then for 5 mana, like you could do them both on one turn. Like you don't have to wait. Like when the second they have 5 mana, all of a sudden they have what that's 8. That's 9 plus 3 is 12. At 12 power all of a sudden. Like that's so fast. Like, and if you just draw this and just have 4 mana, you can immediately do it. Like I agree with Dave. I think the play patterns of this are gonna be really fun.
Yeah, there's like past support, like 3 blind mice from Woe. There's just like a lot of white tokeny stuff in Mice and Rabbits. And this card seems to be very strong in that department. And I think it's going to be like a real role player in those sort of decks.
Awesome. Let's move on to favorites. And this set was really hard for me. For those who don't know, I'm a huge fan of otters. Whenever I take my kids to the zoo, they're always like, we got to take Dad to go see the otters. He loves the otters. One of my favorite tweets ever, I talked about how like you can't have a river otter in Utah because they're actually a local species, whereas like in other places you can own one as a pet. And I'm always jealous of people that don't have river otters locally. Anyway, huge otter guy. This set was really hard for me to do favorites. Okay? Really hard. And I narrowed it down to 2 otter cards. The first one is Otterball Antics. This card is 1 and a blue for a sorcery. Put a 1/1 blue and red otter creature token with prowess. If the spell was cast from anywhere other than your hand, put a 1/1 counter on that creature. And then it has flashback for 3 and a blue. So I don't remember which set it was that we just had that had 2 Teamer Prowess otters that we talked about on the show. Like, oh, like these kind of go together. And then now there's just a bunch of like blue-red is literally prowess otters. But I think that this card, if that deck does exist, I think this card is like both a key piece and also it has my favorite art in the entire set, and it's why it's my favorite. I think this art is so sweet. And also just got a great name. I love everything about this card. I mean, if you're watching the video, I'm smiling from ear to ear. I just love otters.
Do you feel like there's a real path to otter prowess at a,
At your standard table?
video near you, at a competitive event near you?
I would not be surprised if otter prowess was like at least a tier 2 standard deck. I really do think that like there's enough support, and honestly, some of these cards are like a little bit better than I would expect for, like, because typically like they're doing it for limited, right? Like that's typically how you get most of the cards. But like all otter cards that I'm going to talk about today, I think they're 2 or less mana. I don't know. And there's support to make this one cost even less. Like, there's a lot. Also, I think that Wizards is incentivized. And I think that, Mason, you can talk about this from the design perspective, but, like, I think there's some incentives to, like, okay, every time we print an otter, people are really excited that there's an otter in Magic. So if we're gonna do otters, like, let's give them enough juice. Not, like, too much juice, but just, like, enough.
Well, I think that's true of all the like Bloomburrow creature types. They're not like normal creature types. They're the ones that people get excited about, like rabbits and frogs and otter. Like, to be honest, silly creature types is kind of what I would call the set, like the silly set, which is good. Like, it's good to have that. There's a lot of cool stuff there. People are very excited for Bloomburrow. And I think that just in general, I think they've done recently is they've tried to make it so like there is 1 or 2 like block decks in standard. We saw this with Toxic back in all v1, and I think that like this is another example of that, where it's like there's a mouse deck we talked about a bunch, a lizard deck we talked about, or we haven't talked much, but I think we will. There's this otter deck, there's frogs, like there are just things, and there's a lot of support in the hopes that 1 or 2 will make them. And so I'm not sure if otters will be the one that makes it, but I think otters also got some of the coolest like mythics in the set. So there's just a lot of interesting stuff going on.
Yeah. Did you get a chance to look at the art, Abe? I know I saw you eyeing it as I said that. I was curious.
As a Final Fantasy X enjoyer, I have to say the nod to Blitzball overall, just it really sends it home for me.
That's great. My next one is Pearl of Wisdom, another auto card. It is 2 and a blue for a sorcery. This spell costs 1 less to cast if you control an otter. Draw 2 cards. I remember where I was when I think it was either Michael Jacob or Jerry Thompson said that Divination was a standard playable card. And I was like, Divination hasn't seen play in years and years and years. And then I think literally like a year later, Divination literally just showed up in a deck list. And I was like, well, I'm an idiot. This card is obviously Divination on one part, but is a little bit better than that if you have an otter. I typically think that cards like this, for what it's worth, are not going to fit in an aggressively slanted otter like constructed prowess deck, because you need your cards to be pressing your advantage, and I don't know that the advantage that you're trying to press is like total net cards in your hand, right? But I do really love the card. This is another one where the art really spoke to me, and for what it's worth, like, this is the type of card that if in years and years there's a bunch of otter cards printed, this card becomes better and better and better the more otters there are. So
yeah, this is a classic design trick they did recently of take some card that's not the greatest in the world, sees French play, add some trinket text on it, and maybe it sees more play, and that's a net positive. And the otters are trying to either do prowess or storm stuff, which in theory both archetypes are down for divination, because you want to chain off stuff and you need 1 for limited, and that's kind of what they're doing. So yeah, I like this card. It's got cool art too. So, cool role player card. I hope there's a storm otter deck.
am unsurprised that you picked the card with an otter on it that says you could draw 2 otters.
Yeah.
It could be anything. Otters. It could be a boat, or it could be 2 whole otters.
Yeah, this one could be 2. Go infinite on otters.
Mason, what is your first favorite?
My first is Yagra, Eater of All, the legendary creature elemental cat. All the elementals to me today. It's a 6/6 and has ward sacrifice of food. So off the bat, that's going to be a hard ward to pay. Except Yagra says other creatures are food artifacts in addition to the other types, and they have 2 sacrifices permanent, gain 3 life. And whenever a food is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, put 2 counters on Yagra, Eater of All. So one, this is one of my favorites because I think it's just a really cool design. It's like the apex predator. That's sort of the lore in Bloomburrow, and everything is food to Yagra, right? To me, you all look like snacks. 10 out of 10 design, love it. Also, a very interesting thing. Basically, as a ward, sacrifice a creature, but at the upside of, if they have an actual food token, which is the theme of the set, and there's some other stuff from last year in Standard with Woe that tie into that, so that's kind of cool. But it also opens up some combo decks where, like in Pioneer, if you have 2 Cauldron Familiars, 1 in play and 1 in the graveyard, they cycle infinitely. So this might create some new decks there. And I think just in general, a 6/6 that makes your opponent sacrifice a creature, and whenever they lose something, it gets 2+1/+1 counters is really appealing. Obviously, Vein Ripper is stronger, I think, than this for a myriad of reasons. But it's Vein Ripper-esque, I could totally see this card seeing play, and just a great design, fun card, gets you thinking about new things.
I'm a big fan. I think the alt art on this is also super duper sweet.
Mm-hmm.
The first time I read this card, I thought it said that other artifacts are food. And I was like, this card is broken. Like, this card is too good. And then somebody pointed out to me that it said creatures. And I was like, oh, that makes more sense. They didn't goof the ball that bad. So
yeah, I have serious, like, hope for this card as being a contender in, like, bringing back some Cauldron Familiar stuff to Pioneer. Because, like, I mean, for a while there was the Jund versions of, like, the Cat Oven stuff that would play, like, Trail of Crumbs and would play, like, Korvold, but Korvold kind of felt really win more or whatever. But this card kind of ending the game on the spot in a way that Korvold doesn't, while also not costing you additional color of mana, means that you could, like, build a deck that maybe only splashes Mayhem Devil if you want it, or is, like, more focused on kind of green-black food stuff, and has the Cauldron Familiar kill, just because Cauldron Familiar and Witch's Oven are, like, both cards you might want to play in there. And that's actually kind of interesting to me. Like, I think the ability to have, because, like, once it resolves, there's not a lot of window of opportunity to stop someone from comboing if they have, especially other creatures too. Like, if I have some Prosperous Innkeepers and whatever else, and I'm just, like, I can stack my cat to my other cat, and then if they respond to try to, like, do something to my cat, I'm like, I'll stack my other creature. And that all just seems like it's worth not glossing over in terms of, like, playability, but, like, the fact that it even introduces that and kind of takes the idea of let's play Cat Oven, like, competitively, let's take Cat Oven and maybe not play it with Mayhem Devil, those things are all really, like, already a huge display of how cool a card this is and kind of how powerful it is in the right ways.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think there's also other cards that are interesting with it, like in Standard. There's, like, the enchantment that says you tap your food to make mana from Woe, and, like, this creates, like, a whole new thing with that, right? Like, oh, I played the Midnight Feast, it ramps me to this card, and then, like, I can continue doing even more stuff, or maybe your X spells scale a little harder. So I think it's really cool. And I really am excited to see, like, will it be like a black-green mid-range deck? Will it be more combo focused and be like a Storm of the Festivals, a Cavalier type thing? Like, what will players do with Yagra? Very exciting card. Just a great design, 10 out of 10. Best design in the set IMO. Next up is Cruel Claw's Heist. It is black for a sorcery, and it has gift a card. So this is our first instance with gifting. Gifting will happen as the spell resolves, and you'll give something to your opponent, excuse me. So in this case, gifting a card means they will draw a card. There's, like, gifting a fish or whatever, these all resolve as the card is resolving. So my opponent, if I want to, I can gift them a card, so they'll draw one. That's not very exciting. Target opponent reveals their hand. You choose a non-land card from it. Exile that card. If the gift was promise, which is, giving them the card, you may cast that card for as long as it remains exiled and use mana of any type to cast it. So I think it's a really cool 2-mana discard spell that can kind of get anything. And if you're willing to give your opponent another card so they don't go down a card, they stay even, you could potentially, turn your Cruel Claw Heist into something different. So let's say, Spencer is doing something, he tutors his deck, or, I bounce something, I can Cruel Claw Heist it, and now that's my thing. Or he could just play it on curve and be like, yeah, I'm kind of looking for some creatures. I know your deck has a bunch. Let's do that. And also just the joke of you can now thought seize the top of the deck, I think is very funny. And I just kind of like this card. And you can actually play this when your opponent has no cards in hand. You just gift them a card, and if they draw a land, not the best in the world for you. You hit a spell, well, now you've got a 2 mana for their spell, which maybe is good, maybe it's not. So we'll discard.
Is the blue-black exile top 3 of your opponent's deck, pick one, still in standard after this rotation?
Urtai?
No. The
Siphon Insight? No, that rotated.
Yeah, that one rotated.
Yeah, that rotated, yeah.
Okay. I was going to say, the blue-black deck already just wants to, play your spells to win the game, so this would be cool for that, but it sounds like that rotated. I don't know, this card is cool, and I do have a problem with it, though. And I don't like it when the alt art is so much sweeter than the original. And in this one's case, it's like night and day. So,
Derek, dude,
if you're gonna pick this one up, get those alt arts fast.
Abe, what's your first favorite?
So my first favorite is Any Merc Crab, which is 5 blue for a 5/5 creature, elemental crab, with flash, and it costs 1 less to cast for each instant and sorcery in your graveyard. It enters tapped if it's not your turn, and when it enters, it taps up to 2 target creatures. So, yeah, I'm a big fan of big flash creatures, and especially I'm also a big fan of frost breathing people. This is the way I like to play limited kind of card, but also just the thought of playing this card in a blue tempo deck in Constructed does not seem that far-fetched to me. It's if you're making it cheaper, it is a very, very powerful threat on its own. Just like a 2-mana 5/5, has the Tolarian Terror cost reduction going on, and being a flash threat, especially one that interacts with combat, means so much for that in terms of playability, because unlike something like a Tolarian Terror or something like just any of your generic this costs less now kinds of threats, you can leave open your mana and choose to use it as an interactive spell to start pushing damage the turn it comes down, rather than kind of having to let your threat define the race. And it's just the kind of thing I really like to play with. So I'm a bit hopeful and definitely a big fan of the big crab.
I think that there's a reason this card is not a common, because this would absolutely turn Pauper upside down again, which Tolarian Terror already did. I'm a huge fan of this card. I actually would not be surprised if this saw fringe, if not pretty decent amount of standard play.
Yeah, the mono blue deck is basically staying for the most part, and even got some upgrades beyond this one in the set. So yeah, I really like this card. I think it's sweet.
Yeah, if people play fewer Delver Secrets because it's no longer a card legal in the format, and play more Any Merc Crabs because it's huge and based, then maybe that could be better.
We already stopped playing Delver.
Yeah. Unplayable.
Maybe you did, Spencer. Maybe you did.
Let's talk about hopefuls. And
whoa, I don't even get a second favorite.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
It's the pick 2 unless you're Abe set review.
Dude, hold on. Actually, what's so funny?
Go off, Abe. Hold up.
I already know what I was going to say about this one, which was that if it wasn't for the otters, it would have made my favorites. Go ahead, Abe.
All right, this is the pick 3 set review for Spencer. The pick 1 set review for Abe. No, my other favorite is It's Wishing Well. It's an artifact for 3 and a blue. And it says tap, put a coin counter on Wishing Well. When you do, you may cast target instant or sorcery card with mana value equal to the number of coin counters on Wishing Well from your graveyard without paying its mana cost. And if that's what it'll be at, put it in your graveyard, exile it instead, and you can only do this as a sorcerer. And I don't know, it's seasons past in slow motion, sitting in play. It's the kind of card that, like, in the original Eldraine, like, it's a card that feels like it would fit there because it's kind of really sweet and makes you want to play with it, but also it's just an artifact that's really flimsy. And so much like, I don't know, cards like Magic Mirror never had their chance in Eldraine because they would get the Elks instead because of Oko. Like, this is another one that feels like, oh, this is just something that gets abraded. But if not, like, this card's super sweet. Like, it's just very, very cool to be casting things up the chain, wanting to have a certain number of kind of expensive spells that are worth recasting, finding ways to reset your Wishing Well and start from the bottom again. I don't know. All of it seems really fun, and I just like designs like this that make me want to build sweet decks that get the worst and slowest rate of return on snowballing value.
I want to do something with this in Paradox Engine. I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to do, but my Paradox Engine will untap it, and I can keep casting cards. So, like, Thought Scour, Netherworldly Gaze, and stuff like that. I don't know. Just it's a really cool card, and it is interesting.
Okay, Impending Doom from Hour of Devastation. It's another count up from 1 card.
Mm-hmm. Oops, all counting.
I just love the term coin counter. Like, I just think it's funny because, like, I think that there's Magic content that I've listened to historically. They're like, why does it need to be a coin counter? Like, why can't it just be like, you know, whatever counter? And it's like, shut up. Who cares what it's called? It's cool. Like, the card's cool and it's sweet. That's what matters.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think there's a non-zero chance this card could just do something. Like, CT is going to have a deck with this.
I thought about it when I saw it the first time. I was like, is this good enough? It's pretty slow. But is it good enough? And I think I came to the conclusion that I didn't think it was.
It's pretty slow, but if you find a way to turbocharge it, like, you know, at the 3rd activation, you're netting mana.
It's like answer. I think
it's
the thing
not
about
like
these cards,
Bio, for what it's worth.
It's actually not. Better. You're right. It's card advantage.
Just
unironically, I would not be surprised if this card was actually very good in Pioneer Blue-Black Control. Or just, like, play this, immediately cast a Fatal Push, kill your thing, next turn cast another kill spell, and just, like, cast the thing. Like,
as the spells get cheaper, it definitely gets better, Mason. You're right.
Yeah. I just think this card is good. Like, I guess this is a classic game designer thing that happens. Good does not mean it will see play. This is just a very strong version of this card. Like, we've seen, like, you do the thing for free before, but it almost always involves casting spells from your hand. And if I get to double dip my card, like, I guess a good question is, like, do you believe Past in Flames is a strong card? You know, and it's like, yeah, only in context. And it's like, great, Wishing Well's the same. You know, like, if you make the game slow and about trading cards, I think this card is actually super sick. And the Paradox Engine stuff is just, like, funny ha-has that I'd like to do, but I don't know. I think there is something to just this card.
CEDH powerhouse right here. Incoming.
Oh,
for those clamoring for the CEDH content, I guarantee you there's an OTK with this card.
Well, it's in Nadu color, so it has to be good.
There was almost, I don't know if I said this in the show, there was almost a CCMTG CEDH podcast. I'm back.
Great. Let them enjoy Magic the way they want to.
Yeah.
Glad I
love casual EDH.
Let's move on to we got a lot of laughs on this one. Let's move on to hopefuls, and I'm going to start with one. I did not pick this because it was an otter. That's a happy accident for what it's worth. He's looking at me like,
oh, are you calling Ral an otter?
He is. He's an
otter. Interesting.
In this picture.
Interesting.
Ral Cactuit is a legendary planeswalker. Ral, whenever you cast a non-creature spell with a loyalty counter on it, you put a. Sorry, you messed me up, Mason.
So do you know what an otter is? Like,
Have you seen the picture of this card, Mason?
This is not going to make it on the show, I can guarantee you. Do you know in like LGBTQ plus culture when you call someone an otter?
Oh no, I didn't know this.
It's like a gay man, kind of like how Ral is. And so they made Ral an otter. And I said, so did you pick it because Ral's an otter?
You learn something new every day.
I can't believe it.
The animal, the otter, is so core to Spencer.
Yeah. Now you know another thing about otters.
I'm happy I learned that. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put a loyalty counter on Ral. +1, create a 1/1 blue and red auto creature token with prowess. -3, draw 3 cards, then discard 2 cards. -10, draw 3 cards, you get an emblem with instants and sorceries you cast have Storm. Okay. Here's where I'm at. We have seen 4-mana planeswalkers move to sideboard value engines for specific matchups as of, I don't know, it's been like 2 years almost now. And the reason I'm hopeful with this card is I think this one has the juice, and I would like to see a format where cards like this can create value, be engines, and be a part of the format. I think that Magic is more fun when sticky threats are fun to play with, and this one specifically, like, it does something when it comes into, like, both of its modes when it starts are pretty good. You know, if you build your deck around it, it can be really powerful. I really hope that this card gets a crack at it.
So this was the furthest card I knew when working on MH3. It was like you get to know one card from Bloom, like past OTJ, and it was Ral because he has the same thing as Ral, right? Like this Ral and that Ral are like very similar in their passive. And I think it's really interesting because, like, we talk about there's like otters in the set are prowess for Storm, right? And this one leads into the Storm stuff. I do agree with your points, which I think this is a value sideboard one, but it's also really interesting to think about this as like that role for Storm, right? Where it's like, oh, I can do this. And then giving anything, you know, all your instant sorceries having Storm just makes winning the game very trivial. And I really like this card. I'm excited to see this in Phoenix. I'm excited to see like where this card shows up in other decks as like a win condition out of the board. And honestly, it wouldn't surprise me if this is just like there's some L-timed explosion, blue-red base control deck in standard, and this card was just the win con, where, you know, you just like accrue value and eventually win the game.
I could totally see it. I think that's the world I want to live in for what it's worth. And I'm talking specifically about standard. I think this card has the juice, as I said earlier, to see play, as Mason's like outside of standard, but standard is specifically where I'm hopeful for this card. My next one is 3 Tree City. This card is a legendary land. As 3 Tree City enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. It has tap, add for a colorless, and it has 2, tap, add a color, choose a color, add an amount of mana of that color equal to the number of creatures you control of the chosen type. When I first saw this card, I was pretty convinced that it was Nutso Busto. And then the more I thought about it, I was like, well, it's kind of got like a Nykthos-esque problem where it has very clear weaknesses as far as like playing that hard to the board and things like that. But it also, like, I think playing to the board is incentivizing that is good for a lot of games of Magic, because as we say in this podcast all the time, attacking and blocking is fun, and like figuring that out is fun. And so I think this card will lead to, while this card in those type of formats could be really strong for certain types of decks, I also think it's more fun Magic. And thus, I'm hopeful that this card is as good as I think it is.
Yeah, I think 3 Tree City is awesome because it's a card that like almost everyone saw and was like, there's no way they're doing this. Like, creature type Gaia's Cradle, like, no way. And it's just dope. And I think it has, you know, In the older formats, I think elves are the only things that really jump out to me as like could really win it. But like in standard, we talk about a lot of rabbit and mice stuff. And there's a lot of years ahead of us in standard with this card. 3 years is a long time. So I'm really excited to see what happens with this card.
I do think
I honestly wouldn't.
Oh, go ahead.
I honestly wouldn't be surprised also if like goblins had a real use for this. I think goblins a deck that typically has some kind of disparity between either like mana sinks on board, but a large ability to create a lot of tokens, and also doesn't have access to something like Cradle typically, as far as like a powerful place to use this card. But like it doesn't take a lot. I mean, we saw this with Castle Garenbrig and even with Nykthos to an extent in its times in standard, where like this card doesn't have to be completely broken and the best thing to be worth considering playing, or like able to make some of the decks around these creature types be that much stronger.
Yeah, and while I, once again, am thinking of it from a standard perspective, I did have discussions about this card as Mason kind of hinted at about in Legacy. It was not that long ago that mono green, I think they called it Elf Control, was one of, if not the best decks in Legacy. And I think that they would play one of these. Like, I would not be surprised to see that in addition to what they already have. So.
Yep. They take their hopium about Orcish Bowmaster. They put in their 3-tree city and they go, ready to go. My first hopeful is Seasoned Warren Guard. It is a creature, Rabbit Warrior, 1/2. And when this creature attacks, if you control a token, get +2/+0 until end of turn. So it's just a 1-mana 3/2 when attacking. I think there is probably like a green-white rabbit mice deck that's just like tokens and effective creatures like this, like the ones we talked about earlier. I think it's going to be an awesome like standard beatdowny deck. I think this card's really strong. I really hope it's something like that exists. And I just love this kind of card.
Yeah, I mean, another white wonder out that plays well with a Novice Inspector and many of the other just good things you can do. And like, I forgot the name of it, but there's the Star from Eldraine. That's just equal to the number of stuff you got.
Oh,
Bunnycorn.
Yep, real Bunnycorn. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Bunnycorn seems like it goes really well in the world of I'm playing bunnies stuff.
You know what's so funny about that is every time I feel like I lost last standard season to freaking Boros, they just had a Bunnycorn, and like I was like, why does everyone not play this card? Like, if it lands and you don't have a kill spell for it, you just die. Like, it's so freaking big. So
White Charmer Bush.
Is that what it is?
Yeah.
I honestly, I think that there's historical precedence for this exact card. Has this card been printed before?
Not in this exact shape. There are cards like it, but they're not.
Yeah, I swear,
not the shape.
I think there's historical precedence for this card to see quite a bit of standard play. Can I say though, I hate the 1/2 stat line. It's so annoying. But I get it from a design perspective.
Next up, Storm Splitter. 3 and a red creature otter wizard haste 1/4. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, create a token that is a copy of Storm Splitter. Exile that token at the beginning of your next end step. This card is super sick. We talked about the Storm deck in Standard. I think this also opens up for Pioneer. And one of the things to note is since it makes a copy of Storm Splitter, which is this card, it will then scale exponentially, right? Like the Digimon movie. You had 1, then you have 2, and then you have 4. It's not like you have 1, 2, 3, like a normal Storm payoff card would have. And it also works kind of well in defense. But in general, you're obviously going to try to win the game with this card, like via comboing off. I think there's not been anything like that in Standard or Pioneer for years. I'm really hopeful we have a deck like that. There's even the plot. For starters, this card works well with plot cards in general. But there's a kind of expensive plot card that basically gives all your creatures like extra power for all the power they have. For all the creatures you have. And that's a great way to get like 8 of these. And then, all right, I hit you for, creative hook style numbers. So, love Storm Splitter. Sweet card. Hope it does well.
Dude, he's gonna kill people with like a bronze fish skeleton. It's crazy.
That's my character in Elden Ring. I actually sent them the character to model it.
I was gonna say this is the most Elden Ring art of the set with the big bronze fish. Like, I don't know what boss you had to clear to get that, or what it does other than make you make exponential copies of yourself. But that fish alone is selling me on the card.
I hope you die to this in Pioneer.
I hope I don't. I
I
hope I never lose a match of Magic again. So that's probably not true.
Well, now you countered my wish. It's not neither of us work. How about that?
Well, so speaking of wishes, one of my biggest wishes, as it's not too much of a secret, is that I wish that I could play Colossal Hammer in more decks in Magic the Gathering in competitive tournaments.
Say that's a secret wish?
No, I said that it might be a secret to some of you.
I don't think that it's a secret to anyone, Abe.
Well, you know what? It's at least not at odds with anyone else's wish on this podcast. But my first hopeful for that reason is Blacksmith's Talent. This is another one of the classes from the set. It is a single red enchantment. It says when it enters, you create a colorless equipment artifact token named Sword with equip creature gets +1/+1 and equip 2. So you get that at the very base. And then level 2 for 2 and a red. It says at the beginning of combat, on your turn, attach target equipment you control to up to 1 target creature you control. And then level 3 for 3 and a red is during your turn, equip creatures you control have double strike and haste. So, yeah, I mean, this card, along with Fighter class was the one that also made some of the equipping possible. This is another class that plays into working well with a Colossal Hammer as a way to get it going in Pioneer. And, I am hopeful to get to cast that card again. I find the play patterns of decks that play that card, especially aggro decks, to be pretty fun. And I miss it a lot in Modern, as it is gone and never coming back. And anyone who ever insisted that it might, even during the days of like Rhinos and Yawgmoth, was probably huffing the copium. So
I thought that you were going to say that you wished to be a blacksmith in another life, and I was going to inform you, Abe, that I did do blacksmithing in the FFA. Fun fact. So, and if you're ever wondering if fire really does get blue when it gets super duper hot, I will inform you that it in fact does. That actually happens.
I love that you almost said if fire gets hot.
Fire hot.
Sorry.
I mean, that is what I said.
Yeah, I know. It was just funny. Well, it was just funny because you started it. I mean, I'm not gonna edit it. It's just very funny. This doesn't have to be the podcast. Clearly, you got a little ahead of yourself. You're like, if you ever wonder if fire hot. Speaking
of the cards,
this good stuff. I love it.
I'm a little worried about the mana cost of the second ability, Abe. Can you kind of speak to me about that? Like, so obviously you're not equipping the sword. Like, we all agree the second ability is not for the sword that it's creating. But, like, is the card worth its cost?
I think that the repeated ability to equip for 0, that is something that the current like hammer cards in Pioneer does not have.
I definitely
There's no Pure Steel Paladin.
I thought it was something else. Good talk.
Yeah,
no,
it's not just on resolution of that ability. Yeah. It's every combat. You get to have something pick up the hammer.
Good talk.
That I think makes it a little bit more appealing. You do have to still be like wanting to do this, and your point about part 1 of the class not quite being super exciting definitely stands, but I think that if you're set on doing this, as I am at times, then you gotta play with what you got. You don't get to just bring whatever cards you want to the Pioneer tournament. You gotta play the ones that are legal. Even though your deck's not good enough for Modern anymore, you can't just show up with it to the next format. No one's gonna let you. I've asked. So
what's next, Ian?
Yeah, my next my next card I'm hopeful for is Sunspine Links, which is 2 red for a 5/4 elemental cat. It says players can't gain life, damage can't be prevented. And when it enters, it deals damage to each player equal number of non-basic lands that player controls. I'm really most hopeful for this card as a way to kind of curb what we saw unfold in the last standard format, and especially towards the late phases of that format and currently in Pioneer with the Niv decks, but like Triomes and Astral Cornucopia and just the amount of like multicolor life gain nonsense feels like it needs more ways to keep it in check, and I'm very hopeful that this is a good way to punish that enough to continue to make it so it does not remain the predominant best thing to be doing in any format. And I think that just like the rate on a card like this of being like kind of a top end thing, so if you're really punishing someone, it should kind of feel like it has haste at minimum in terms of damage it's dealing, and also just the a lot of the answers to it that like might incidentally gain life won't gain life in killing it immediately. And it has some amount of value of like, okay, if I can flicker this is pretty strong too. So that's what I'm hopeful for. I really do just worry about like, and I started to worry after playing a little bit more Pioneer with that card taking off, but just like it's so much life to add to a game of Magic that there needs to be ways to beat that or to meaningfully try to like subvert that gameplay pattern, and it's just a lot.
We obviously talked about this specifically after the Star City and my event in Vegas, where I talked about like I had played against that deck a bunch, and then that card kind of tipped a matchup that I thought was pretty favorable for me. I also think that like Lightning Helix in that deck has been like such a huge get, and this card doesn't die to it. I really like this pick.
Yeah, I think this card's good. I'll never forget the moment Abe came back from his local Pioneer RCQ and was just like talking about like the Niv Mizzet mirror he saw or whatever. It was very much, I think, a canon event in your Magic Pioneer life, or just like it did irreparable harm to you and you've never forgotten it. Because I feel like ever since that day, you've been on it. And I do think Cornucopia is a very strong card. It's going to see a lot of standard play post rotation. I think this is like a great tool for stopping that in both formats.
For what it's worth, like that deck was super popular in Utah this Pioneer season. Like basically you had to prepare for Niv. And I think that there are unfun things about formats, like if the format becomes about that. So it is something to think about.
Yeah. I mean, if we're going to just talk quickly about too much life gain, if I can stand in the soapbox for just 2 more seconds, like the reason that was such a canon event for Mason, and I just watched like an entire, the match was decided by a like game loss in deck registration, and then the game one just played out for 55 minutes, and then a winner was decided by way of the game not finishing. And I was like, if you have this many cards that are going to encourage kind of the I will inevitably get you and wait you out, it does really promote problems at an RSQ level in terms of tournament logistics and just like a miserable play experience for people playing against those people, especially people who are new to the game. Like sitting down and just playing like an hour's worth of maybe 1.5 games of Magic and like feeling unsatisfied by that is something to make you not want to play another RSQ again. And so having some way to be like even if that happens to you and then you're at the tournament, you watch someone else like play 2 of these and their opponent takes like 12 and then dies, you're like, oh, okay, there is a world, like the game does work in a way that this doesn't just win all the time, and I shouldn't just worry about this. Like that makes a big difference.
Mm-hmm. Let's move on to hits. And I gotta say, this is a historical pick 2 set review for me. Every single card on our hits almost made my hits. Or did make my hits. Like every single one. These are all cards that I was considering for this. So I think we might have actually just gotten the best 6 cards, guys. I think we might have happened. I'm going to go first. I got Stormcatch Mentor. It's an Otter Wizard. We all know what Spencer's doing this set review. It's a 1/1 for blue and a red. It has haste and it has prowess, and instant and sorceries spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. I just think this card is like pretty good, and it's pretty good. I think it does what you want for this card to do in multiple decks, as Mason's kind of hinted at. It is a little bit worse, I think, in the aggressive deck style decks than it is in the storm style decks, which I think that people are missing on. But I think this, Goblin Electromancer is already, a card that people played, and I think this one's substantially better. Next up on my hits, we have the infamous Crewclaw. It is a 3/3 Weasel Mercenary with a menace. Whenever Infamous Crewclaw deals combat damage to a player, exile the top card of your library until. I'm going to reread this. Whenever the Infamous Crewclaw deals combat damage to a player, exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card. You may cast that card by discarding a card rather than paying its mana cost. So if you're in our Discord, you know that our friend Yeoman5 thinks this card is boosted. I'm not there. I don't think this card is boosted. I do think, however, this card is really, really good. Specifically in Standard. Possibly more if you can, abuse it, but I don't think the play patterns of this will actually be abused. I think this card is just a value engine, and I think its closest comp is Glissa in a lot of ways, and I think that it's going to be a value engine that's going to be really annoying, because there are already really good black creatures at rate that you have to use your removal on that do a lot of stuff, and just having another one, it's gonna be rough. I think it'll be so tough to overcome this plus the other things going on.
Yeah, I think this card, I do think it has Glissa-esque play patterns where it's if it connects, it is very strong. And I'm not a huge believer in building my deck in a way to actually cast insanely large spells. Like we saw from the Pro Tour Standard that people put the Caustic Bronco in their deck with the ability to set up the Shadow of Mortality and 12 someone. And it was oh, that's cool, but I can just play Caustic Bronco and just gain some, I take some damage, you take some damage sometimes, good cards. And I think that's the secret to this card too, where it's just did you draw your 5th land in your deck that only wants to play 4 or whatever? Discard it and hit a spell, and just make sure you never flood out and lose is a really powerful thing. And when the dust settles and they match up where your opponent can't block this card, which is not trivial when that card has menace, then I think it is going to be very strong in those spots. I do think it is also one that will probably see a lot more shine once rotation happens. But I think it is a strong card, for sure.
I think it's worth mentioning that, it's easy to compare this to Glissa because it is a really powerful combat-centered creature that generates card advantage. But really, this card doesn't just generate card advantage in a virtual sense. It creates, a ton of mana advantage as well. You're not just drawing a card when this card connects. You are getting to have the option to cast the card that you exiled from the top of your library for another card in your hand. So it's not just, oh, I drew my 5th land. It's also oh, I'm on 3 lands and I exiled another one of my top end threats, and I'm going to discard this. I could discard another copy of my top end threat. Now I'm casting a pitch spell version of it, right? I'm just generating 3 mana by discarding, this card. And that's really, really powerful just on face when you talk about threats. But the second that this can connect and cast the discard spell that Mason was talking about earlier in the show by discarding, some 1-drop or 2-drop that you drew or some removal spell you don't need, or even a threat that might have been good, but maybe just taking their wrath out of their hand is better. Those are plays that really feel unfair, as is evidenced by when that happens in Modern and people don't pay any mana to take cards out of your hand. People clamor for it to be banned for months and years. So it's just like I think it's important to think about not just this card as a card advantage, filtering through what it is you see kind of thing, like lands and spells. It's also just a massive amount of mana to like you could effectively like time walk your opponent pretty easily just by getting to show and tell in the card from your hand, or like the card from the top of your library by discarding something weaker in your hand. And that's just I don't want to lose sight of just how good this card is when it connects, but just like Lissa, it has the issue of I need to be connecting with this 3-mana 3/3, and that can be its own challenge in itself.
I do think, for what it's worth, it's in better colors than Glissa to make sure that it connects, which is something else I wanted to mention. Like, I do think that Black Red specifically, there's going to be so many things so that, like, and because it has Menace, like, a removal spell can make it, even if it's not connecting this turn, okay, well, you're going to double block this, I'm going to kill your thing, you're going to have to do it again. Like, I think its play patterns are going to be, I think they'll be more fun than they will be problematic. So,
yeah, it depends on what you mean by problematic. Right? I think getting to cast your spells when your mana screwed, or getting Tanya to play is cool.
Yeah,
and like it's you can't plan for too. Like if there's like you hit a kill spell connected, so there's like probably one creature on the battlefield or was erased. You know what I mean? Like they had no creatures, and so it's just very interesting. I think part of the thing is that like Llanowar Elves is going to be in standard in like 2 months, and so like Galissa really makes it hard. But my real question is like, can I play Jund mana where I go Elf on 1, Cruel Claw on 2 consistently? Because that is a really strong way. Like per Abe's like you're not even discarding lands. I'm just like evoke my Shieldred essentially with my Shieldred. Just put this in play, and then pass or whatever. If they my land drop, hold up a kill spell, whatever. Like that kind of stuff is just unbeatable a lot of the time. Also, Shieldred plus Cruel Claw's Heist. I want to gift you a card. Take 2. It's a dream. So, my next card is Paw Patch Recruit. It's green, right? Creature, Rabbit Warrior. 2/1. It has Trample. And whenever a creature you control becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control other than that creature and has Offspring for 2 to make a 1/1. I think this is just a solid, like, play to the battlefield per that deck I've been talking about a couple times of, like, Rabbit and Mice, Green, White, whatever. And then you make more of them if you're in the mid game, like we talked about before with Abe's 1-drop. And just if you go to kill a creature, one of the other ones gets bigger, so there's some inherent built-in protection, So, like, if I have a couple things on the battlefield, I play this, they go to kill my Champion of the Harish or whatever, my scaling 1-drop. Well, now I give, some other creature an extra counter. I, Offspring this, my opponent tries to kill one of them so they can get their Cruel Claw. Not great for me, but I now have, a slightly bigger other one. I just think this card has a good body with a good effect. So I'm in.
Yeah, this is actually the card that I was thinking about specifically when I mentioned the Offspring mechanic earlier in the show. I think that, like, in a deck that wants this card, the ability to, like, have more curve out options and use all of your mana is super important. And the fact that this card offers it and does it with, like, another body, kind of like Apes, where it's like, oh, it's not that much worse than the other body. I think this card's really powerful.
I think this one gets better with another body too, in a way that my card doesn't. Like, if you Offspring this on an empty board and they shock your 2/1, you have a 3/3 trample now because you're able to get a trigger for each of their passives. So, did they really, like, they went from 3 power and play looking at them to now 3 power and play looking at them. It didn't really change much about their situation, and games are not such that players can really, like, avoid poking the bear in this way, right? It's like there's not a lot of decks that can feasibly interact with an aggro deck like this and, like, just say, okay, I'm just not going to point your removal spells to your creatures. You can have all your creatures untouched. I'll just, I got you. I will just not cast removal spells. And this way, I'll avoid putting counters on your creatures, and nothing bad will happen to me. Like, that's just not how none of these things really work. And I think that gives this card a lot of staying power as not only like a 3-drop kind of innocuous value card to protect the rest of your curve, but even just like a 1-mana 2/1 trample is a very good rate on a creature if you're playing an aggressive deck. So
yeah, it's a 1-drop that plays well with elves too, right? Like elves typically doesn't play well with ones, and this is one where you can go like turn 1 elf, and then maybe you want to curve out and play like your green stompy creatures or whatever. But maybe your opponent's also a deck full of removal, and you offspring this on turn 2. Per that, okay, well I have to kill the elf, right? I can't let Spencer stay ahead on mana, and they turn to go for the throat the elf or whatever after combat, or I guess they probably do it before someone casts a spell, right? But like if they do that, then like Abe said, the rabbits are getting even bigger, and now it's getting out of control really quickly. So I think Paw Patch Recruit is just going to be a big part of Standard for the next couple of years. And I think this next card has a chance to be right there with it, and also great in Pioneer Mono Green. The machine's back, boys. As we have Scrap Shooter, 1 green, creature, raccoon, archer, 4/4. It has gift a card, so I can let my opponent draw a card to give an ability. This has reach, so 4/4, reach for 3. And then when it enters the battlefield, if I gave them the gift, I can destroy target artifact or enchantment opponent controls. 3-mana 4/4s we have seen to be quite good. I've talked about Llanowar Elf a lot. I'm going to do that for the next 5 years, so 2029. And Scrap Shooter is just very strong in that kind of curve. Just good in green-black mid-rangey decks. Like you play this as like a pretty good body, controls the sky. It's a pretty important thing in Standard with decks like Fairy Mastermind. And then, if you ever play against like a Virtue, like the white or the black one are 2 very popular ones, then this answers that. And then Pioneer, having this as be one of your flex slots, I think is potentially very reasonable in the main deck, and also a great sideboard option to just trigger my Kiora, add a lot of devotion, trigger my Outcaster, blow up your card, like that is fine to do. And I think this card's just a home run.
I was playing one Blue Chronos not that long ago in my list, and I think I would play this card over it. Giving them a card doesn't really matter if you're drawing 2 as you're doing it. And I also think that from like a standard I'm going to stick on Pioneer for just a second. At what point do we just have enough 4-power, 3-mana green creatures that stompy deck is real? Have we gone so far that it's just never going to be real? Or like,
yeah, I think that part's already like we had them before. Like this isn't better than Old Ghost Roll, I think, in that kind of deck.
Okay.
That's
my thought too, but I thought I'd mention it. But yeah, I think in Standard, like, this is a great rate creature that has upside, and this is the type of stuff that I typically play.
Yeah, I think especially even just as like a main deckable role player in a lot of the mid-range decks, like a 4/4 body is very good in the early turns against a lot of the aggressive decks, and then also a lot of decks are trying to build something bigger, have enchantments need to answer, artifacts need to answer, and when that's the case, typically giving your opponent a card versus their invested mana into that is just not, it's not even close to equivalent exchange. You're coming out ahead there, just about every time. So that was definitely one I expect to see a lot of play even before you consider Llanowar Elves. Now it's just one of the best things you can cast for 2 green pips on 3 mana.
Abe, what is your first?
So my first hit is Blooming Blast. Blooming Blast is 1 in a red for an instant, where you can gift your opponent a treasure. And Blooming Blast deals 2 damage to our creature. If the gift was promised, it also deals 3 damage to that creature's control. So this one was almost one of my sleepers, but I think it is just that good as is that I just consider it a hit. And this is because there's not an existing, like, really playable Searing Blood effect in Pioneer that you can play with Gigantha until this card. And this card just, like, Searing Blood was already a reason people would forgo Gigantha in the matchups where it was really good. Just having a way to, like, when you're taking the role of a burn deck and really pressuring the opponent's life total, like, killing their creature and dealing damage, right? Advancing both parts of your game plan is so worth it. And in a lot of those spots, like the decks where that is very good, giving your opponent one more mana is not really the difference between winning and losing. When you're taking the role of like a burn deck with those decks, it's really more about just trading off for all of their cards. And then in that stage of the game where you're kind of both top decking, having their life total low enough through having drawn enough Searing Blazes or Searing Bloods, or getting enough hits in with like the right threats of yours that you can close the game with your reach. And this card plays really, really well into that because the gift doesn't undo that while still making it something that you like want to think about. And if it is a matchup where you can't afford to give them that treasure, or like the game doesn't dictate it, you can still just kill their creature or deal damage to their creature with the spell. And I think that it slotting into being Gigantha compliant means that it's a card you'll see a lot of in the red decks, like for quite a while, just because of the pedigree on being that effect.
Yeah, this was a card that I kind of thought was going to be a pretty big pioneer player, kind of like what you're saying there, and just being able to like main deck your Searing Bloods, and then like you were saying in the matchups where you want them, like go up more if that's what it's about, right? Like you can have like 8 Searing Blazes, and I feel like if you're a dedicated burn deck, that's one of those times where like this sort of redundancy doesn't actually hurt, right? Like if the matchup's about this, it is about this, and if you just like have even like, let's not even consider you have an out, like a slick shot. You just have a prowessy creature, like a 1/2, getting in for that little bit of extra damage, pushing, undoing their play, weaving it into your turns is so huge. So I love this card. I think it's a big hit.
And then bringing us home, my other hit is Fountain Port. A Fountain Port is a land that taps for colorless, or you can pay 2 colorless mana and tap it to sacrifice a token to draw a card. Or you can pay 3 colorless mana, or 3 mana, tap it, pay a life, and create a 1/1 blue fish creature token. Or you can pay 4 and tap it and create a treasure token. So this is kind of like a trading post callback of like, oh, I can fidget around for like several turns with the same permanent and go up a card over the course of like 3 turns and for 9 mana. Except I think the difference is that, we're seeing right now cards like Mirrex are really important, just ways to like get a lot of value out of your lands. And also there are a lot of ways that people generate a lot of oddball tokens that don't wind up doing anything. A lot of treasures that might wind up being, not used well. Opponents might be gifting you food tokens or treasures, like with cards like Blooming Blast. And having an outlet for converting those into cards that are more valuable, and also just being a land that allows, a deck to expend its extra mana, I think is really, really valuable. And I think it's just a card where it's always going to be something that will show up in places where the mana base just allows for it. It's a lot of opportunity. It's not a high cost to a lot of decks to add the first copy of a land like this, especially really, really slow decks in like 1 or 2 colors, versus the upside of having access to a card like this in a really long game. And I think that just, I think that having access to this, even if it's not while Mirrex is still in the format, because they might be occupying too much of the same space if you're not doing some of the token synergy stuff, like as soon as that rotates, this is going to be the next I'm going to do nothing win condition that you need to keep in mind as being one of the options.
I saw this card and actually just thought it was better than Mirrex, to be honest. Part of that is like Trading Post. It's like one of my like top whatever Magic cards ever printed. I think that card's really cool. But I think that like the ability to just create a treasure token and like, nothing happened on a turn sequence and you make something happen and you get to pick which one it is just really powerful. Additionally, I think that the games where it becomes about this is so much better than Mirrex in. Like, the fish can block, first of all. And I don't know. I think that's huge. I just think you're like, pay 1 life, create a 1/1. It's like, yeah, but you're paying the 1 life, but you get to block. Like, you can block a 5/5 with that 1/1. So I don't know. That's my thoughts.
I think this card's gonna be way better for like make a treasure, draw a card the next turn. Like I think that's gonna be what like I feel like you will just, make a fish, block like a Shieldred or something like that, some big creature, and sometimes for sure. But I do think the pay a life is like kind of meaningful a fair bit of the time. But I think just being able to like bank mana, and then if you don't need that mana, turn it into cards, it's very real. So it's a very cool and strong card. I'm excited to see what it does.
That is going to do it for our pick 2 set review. Let us know in the comments, what would be your hopefuls, your favorites, the things that you think are going to be hits in the set. Because now Spotify has comments too. So you can comment on YouTube and Spotify with those type of thoughts, and we'd love to see them. No Patreon question this week. Every week on the show, we do like to answer questions from our patrons, but during the pick 2, the episode goes a little bit longer, and we want to give you the most out of our cards. But if you want to join the conversation, head over to the Patreon Discord. That is for patrons of $5 or more. Go to patreon.com/ccmtg for that, as well as the public Discord for all of Easy Game Media. And head on over to leave a comment, give a like, give a sub, a review on YouTube. A couple of weeks ago, we were asked, what's the best way to support the show just on a platform? And YouTube technically right now would be the best, because watching it there affects the algorithm and leaving comments like that. So, but yeah, leave a review everywhere. It helps with the show. Where can people find you, Abe?
People can find me over at twitter.com/morenothings. And I'm actually reaching, like, I have just about 1 slot left to cover for coaching. I'm getting close to full. So if you're interested in doing coaching with me, just send me a DM on Twitter, or if you are a listener who does not use Twitter, feel free to send me an email over at morenothings@gmail.com. Just put coaching in the description.
You can find me over on Twitter at Mason E. Clark. You can find me at twitch.tv/TheMasonClark. If you want to reach out for coaching, you can do that on Twitter or my email, masoneclark@gmail.com. I've got some spaces available if you're wanting to do that, as we're heading inevitably closer to the RC along with the RCQ season. And you can also find me on TCG Player every now and again writing. Spencer, where can they find you?
You can find me at Easy Game on Twitter. You can find me every week on the Need to Nerd podcast, where we talk about nerd culture stuff. Really fun. My co-host has been getting raving reviews for his Quasimodo casting that he is doing at one of our local theaters, and I got to see it. It was absolutely amazing, and all of the amazing reviews he's getting are well worth it. And yeah, you can also find me on TikTok for all of the podcast stuff. You can find the podcast on TikTok basically everywhere. We're at CCMTG or CCMTG Pod. And thank you so much for listening, everybody. We'll see y'all next week with another episode of Constructed Criticism.